Hello everyone, this is Facilities Manager Mitch from the inside of the summer house at the edge of the property of the Seward House Museum, which is behind me here. And in the Seward House Museum's continuation of its focus on the environment for the month of April, today I'm going to be talking about William Seward's interest in horticulture. And horticulture is something that some of you might be familiar with. It's very similar to agriculture, and both agriculture and horticulture were popular movements in the 19th century when the Sewards were living here at 33 South Street. And this is in large part due to the fact that growing, and growing food specifically, was local for many people in the 1800s. Without modern technology for transportation or to prolong growing seasons, chances are the things you were growing or consuming were grown at home by you or by somebody in the town or city where you lived if you were to buy it from a market. Now, it's important to distinguish agriculture from horticulture here. Agriculture is the growing of food or crops and raising of animals for consumption or sale at a market. Horticulture, on the other hand, is your own growing of trees, shrubs, maybe constructing outbuildings like a summer house on your property, as a means to develop the landscape that your house sits on for your personal enjoyment, decoration, fancy, or beautification. And the horticultural movement was very popular amongst Americans in the first half of the 1800s, amongst the Sewards specifically. And in 1832, the New York Horticultural Society was formed by a young writer by the name of Jesse Bewles. And Bewles published an article known as The Cultivator, very popular here in upstate New York, several copies owned by the Sewards. In fact, we still have original copies of the Seward family's versions of The Cultivator in our collection today. Frances Seward, William Seward's wife, was a devout reader of The Cultivator and would write letters to her husband about reading her Bewles, as they were informally called. And these publications inspired the Sewards to grow things like dahlias and hyacinths throughout the garden. Now, William Seward was a big fan of developing the outdoor landscape of his estate because the indoor estate was still run by Elijah Miller, his father-in-law, an original inhabitant of the property here at 33 South Street. So William and Frances turned their attention to the outside. And not long after moving here to 33 South Street did the Sewards develop quite an impressive landscape. Many residents in Auburn were very familiar with the somewhat urban, somewhat rural landscape of the Seward estate. Seward would write to his close friend and political ally Thurlow Weed quite often about his interest in continuing to grow the property here on South Street, saying that he was a big fan of the trees that would let in light, that would allow him to repose in a mellow fashion. So Seward was experiencing the horticulture movement firsthand, and by the time he was elected governor of New York State in 1839, his horticulturalist efforts were recognized by a growing group in the capital region. And this group was the New York Horticultural Society of the Valley of the Hudson. And this group elected Seward to be an honorary member once he became governor in 1839. Now, the founding member of this society was Andrew Jackson Downing, and Downing was a renowned horticulturalist in the Northeast region by the time of Seward's election to the governorship. In fact, throughout the 1840s, Downing was becoming a household name in horticulture because of his accessible and approachable methods to horticulture. His drawings were easy to understand, his writings and recommendations for people wanting to undertake horticulture in their own homes were easy to interpret and replicate, so people were really gobbling up Downing's trends in the horticulturalist movement. And Downing was the one who recommended that Seward become an honorary member of this horticultural society in the capital region. Now, as Downing was becoming more and more popular and the horticultural movement was growing in the Northeast, Jesse Bewles took notice of Downing's talents and recruited him for the Cultivator. And not long after doing so did a new horticulturalist publication come about. This one, titled The Horticulturalist, was edited by Andrew Jackson Downing. The Sewards, of course, had several editions of The Horticulturalist, many of them signed by both Bewles and Downing, and remain in the collection of the Seward House Museum today. Now, the Horticulturalist was a phenomenal success after first being published in 1846. Within a year of its publication, the Horticulturalist was published in 29 states and Canada. And the Horticulturalist was an opportunity for people to learn about new trends in horticulture, to find out exactly what they should be planting and why, and also how to arrange those plantings in such a way that complemented the architecture of their home or place of dwelling. And so the Horticulturalist was wildly popular because of this approachability. It also was meant for people of more modest means and in-town homes, much like the Seward house here. Homes that were not quite in the middle of a city, but not quite out in the middle of nowhere in a more rural setting. This middle-of-the-road approach to horticulture increased access to the field even more, and horticulture became a very popular hobby among Americans, not just something that professionals could do. And Seward would really take this horticultural knowledge to the next level on his own estate here in Auburn, and try and influence people he was closest to join him in these new trends in horticulture. Now, Seward would write to a friend of his in the 1840s, several years after the Horticulturalist has been published now, trying to convince his friend, his friend's wife, and his friend's children to join him in this horticulturalist movement. And Seward would write to his friend, "I want to fill Frances's head with imaginings of embellishment for her grounds, and her apron with roots and seeds to give those imaginings a reality. I feel quite important in my experience and want to impart it to somebody who has charity enough for me to be blind to the rudeness of my horticulture and to the bizarre of my task. If we had your little Mary here, we would make a May Queen of her every day in the month, and we would keep little George patiently waiting till certain by the temptations of ruddy peach blossoms, clusters of pulpy grapes, and butternuts, walnuts, and filberts ready to drop into little mouths." Now, Seward was deeply passionate about horticulture and growing the gardens even more here in his home in Auburn. He would write very fondly of his intentions to grow the estate here, writing that his true intentions were to lie with his family in the garden from morning to night and to play truant to the office, many an hour to enjoy with them the sight and perfume of the primroses, daffodils, and hyacinths. And Seward would consult his copies of the Horticulturalist each spring, and he would do research on what he should grow and where, and propose these ideas to his wife, Frances, in various letters over the course of his staying in Washington when he becomes a United States Senator and then Secretary of State. So these letters that Seward writes to his wife were ways that he could bond with her over their mutual admiration for growing their gardens here in Auburn through trends in horticulture. And one letter that Seward fondly writes to his wife really shows how deeply passionate he was, both about staying connected to his wife back at home and also growing the gardens even more. He would write to Frances from Washington one spring, "I hear the bluebirds and robins singing merrily every morning. I suppose they are on their way north to take up homes around the house, our house. I imagine you going into the garden with your India rubber boots this blessed and bright March day, and the flowers springing up to meet you." Now, Seward would retire in 1869, and he had 40 years invested into growing his estate here in Auburn. Many decades of new plantings, different arrangements, smells, sights, and sounds, all carefully cultivated by him over the course of his 40-year career. And late in his life, he's reflecting on all of these enhancements, quite proud of his accomplishments. So he would write, "To my eye, the garden, the fountain, and the birds that stretch far out from the terrace away from the house are richer and nobler ornaments of the drawing room than any combination of damask, rosewood, and gold that the Fifth Avenue of Madison Square exhibits." Clearly, Seward had a strong tie with nature, and continuing that tie through what he was growing here in Auburn. So it's clear that these gardens were very important to William Seward, and that he was a very prominent member of the horticulturalist movement that was very popular in the 1800s. And so I hope I've inspired you in this era of social distancing and working from home to continue this trend in horticulture. And hopefully you might be able to find ways that you can enhance the place in which you live with different plantings, arrangements, and decorations of nature to lessen the distance that you have with nature, similar to how the Sewards were doing the same thing here for much of the 1800s.